so much, Jenner. It is a joy and a privilege to be with you. Um, I see we have a group of people here. If there's any way you'd feel comfortable turning on your video, I would greatly appreciate that because it's a little bit weird. And if you've ever spoken to a screen before, you know it's a little bit weird because you don't necessarily see reactions. And I have a couple of jokes, and I need to know how they come across during the evening. So, yeah, as much as you're able to have them on, thank you so much. It's great to see your faces. And no pressure. Like if you have to turn it off to go do whatever, warm up your coffee or something, that's fine. I get it, but it's really, really helpful to me. So I'm going to dive right into it, and I'm going to be looking down a little bit because I have my keyboard down here, and I have slides I'm going to put on, and I have to use my finger shortcut to get there. So here goes. When I came home after presenting out in the world in public as a woman for the first time, I cried. I wept like someone in mourning. Cried and cried and cried. It wasn't that it didn't feel good. In fact, it felt really wonderful. And it wasn't that it was wrong, because it wasn't. It was beautiful. It was just so intense being seen in public. A lot of those memories are wedged into my soul. It was a cool, sunny afternoon here in Southern California. It was winter time. It was a perfect day for a drive and a cappuccino and a walk in the park, which is all I did. Pretty banal day. I had the day off from work. My kids were in school and my wife was tied up in her job, and so out I went. And I remember how visceral the whole experience was for me. I'll never forget how people looked at me, in all honesty. I felt as though they were looking directly through me, directly to my soul. I noticed every single detail that came up, every look, every glance, every reaction, every comment. I remember being filled with really, really intense fear. You know, what if someone says something nasty? What if I'm hurt? What if someone from the church sees me? Um, it was really, really scary. And, you know, looking back on it, at least at the time in my life, I think it was perhaps the most exposing thing that I'd ever done in my whole life. You know, my trans identity, my gender had been, up until that point, it had been my greatest vulnerability. It had been the thing that I was the most scared of anyone ever finding out. And so being out in the world for everyone to see, it was like they could see my most vulnerable, deepest secret. So here's kind of, you know, a core thing I want to say today, which is being visibly transgender is hard. It's really hard. And the greatest reason why that's the case is not so much the pain of gender dysphoria, which is kind of this internal mismatch between the body and the roles that we were given as a child or at birth, and what we know to be true in our souls. It's not so much about gender dysphoria. It has a lot more to do with the cultural milieu we live in. We live in a culture that looks at trans people with a sense of disgust and suspicion and fear, or maybe pity, or maybe just wants us to go away, maybe just wants to erase us. And I'm not going to repeat here in this moment, right now, today, all the different challenges that trans people have recently faced. I mean, like I was talking with some colleagues about a school board meeting in Riverside County that's happening, I believe, tonight, that specifically involves a debate about trans people and essentially whether or not we should exist. It's like really, it's been really, really hard. So I'm not going to go into details on that. But it feels as though, to me, that the last few years, the last 5 years maybe especially, but the last 10 years have brought a lot of visibility to the trans community, but also a good degree of hostility, or condemnation and scrutiny as well. Now, that hostility towards trans people is not a new thing. In fact, it might be that things have never been better for trans people in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly that may be the case if we're thinking about the last 100 years or so. I recently read Susan Stryker's magnificent book, Transgender History. Um, and it's just brilliant. I can't recommend it highly enough. I've read it a couple of times, and it taught me so much about how trans people have always been with us. And we've had different names and different ways of describing and different treatments available, but gender expansiveness is something that's been with us for a very, very long time. And one of the things I learned in this book, for example, was about impersonation laws, which up until the 1960s, even later in some places, it was illegal for me to do what I did on that winter afternoon in sunny Southern California, because I was out and I had been assigned male at birth and I was wearing a dress and it was fabulous, but it also wouldn't have been okay. In fact, there were all sorts of different laws to prevent that. You could be put in jail for impersonating the opposite gender. There were what was called a 3-article rule. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, but if you were a trans person and you were presenting as your true gender when you were out in public, you had to wear at least 3 articles of clothing of your the gender that's associated with your sex assigned at birth. 3 articles of clothing, and if you weren't, you were arrested, and they didn't find 3 articles, then you would be guilty of impersonation. But the 3 articles was your protection, and you know these laws, these so-called impersonation laws, is part of the reason why in movies like Paris is Burning, or the TV show, if you've seen it, Pose, that portray a picture of what the ball scene was like in the 1980s and 1990s. These laws were part of why at the ball scene, there were entire categories that was called realness, and essentially it was a way for people to test themselves and to see how cis passing or how straight passing they could be. And you won an award if you could pass as straight. And the reason that was a thing was because people's very survival was on the line. They could be arrested and jailed for looking too queer. Really, really remarkable stuff. We've been through a lot. Here's that video cover, Paris is Burning. It's on HBO right now, actually. So if you have HBO Max, you can watch this brilliant, brilliant documentary. And I believe it was in Sundance. It's an independent film. Really, really, really powerful stuff. If you listen to our transcestors, that's a term, I don't know where I picked it up, but I really like it. If you listen to our transcestors, our trans elders, they will tell about how unemployment, underemployment, a life of unwanted sex work was common for trans people transitioning in decades before. One of the ladies I like to follow is this lady named Marty Puranek. She has an Instagram. I think her handle is Marty Pants with a Z. She's delightful. But she transitioned at age 17 in the 1970s, and sadly, most of her peers at that time, most of her trans peers did not survive. And she's one of the few. I think she's in her 60s now, and she talks about how way back when, even in the 90s, when people would transition, it was like going into witness protection. You had to really disappear and create a whole new life for yourself because it just wasn't safe in any way. Being visibly trans is hard. It's really, really, really hard. But I don't think it has to be that way. And I think that we can do something to change it. I grew up, as Jenner said, in conservative Christian subculture. I grew up in a rural town in Washington State, southeastern Washington. And I'm going to speak some tonight from that experience. And I think that it's relevant to probably most of us, even if we don't share that precise experience with conservative Christian culture. So if you didn't share that experience, please stick with me. But I'm going to speak from my experience, but I think you're going to relate with it. I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. So just up the road from Mount San Jacinto College is Loma Linda University. That's a Seventh-day Adventist university and medical school. So I grew up in that kind of tribe. And it's a conservative, very conservative Protestant denomination. My family was Adventist many generations back, at least 5 generations. And, you know, on both sides of the family, not just were Adventists, but we're also ministers, you know. And let me see if I can get my picture back on the screen. This was my home church. I had many ministers on both sides of the family. I have grandfathers, only grandfathers, mind you, only men, going back at least 5 generations who were pastors just like me. And this is my home church. That's a banner that I put up when I was working there. I love my church, and I truly did, you know, and I truly do still. I grew up in a community that gave me many, many gifts and many, many positive experiences. I had a really beautiful sense of community. My home religion gave me a sense of meaning. I had all sorts of weekly, monthly, yearly rituals that gave structure to my life. I had lots of opportunities. I got to have the privilege of going through private education. I went to college. Many, many gifts. This is a picture of me with some of my friends when I was 15 years old. So lots of positive experiences. Let's see. I'm trying to get it the right. We're going to stay there. Okay. And you know, with those positive experiences, I also grew up believing that something was wrong with me. And in my spiritual tradition, it was often called sin, S-I-N. It's a theological word, but it's also sort of a moral word. And it's really loaded culturally. But essentially, I was taught that I was born broken, and I was born with something wrong with me that needed to be fixed. And I didn't just inherit that concept that something was wrong with me, but I also inherited a whole lot of homophobia and a whole lot of transphobia from the culture that I was in. I mean, American culture at large, of course, as well, but also from teachers and from family members and from friends. Some of it was subtle, some of it was overt, but I was filled with it through my early life in the 1980s and the 1990s. I remember having a biology teacher around that time of this picture, railing, going off for a whole hour in high school about homosexual sexual activities and how evil and wrong they were, just detailing all sorts of different acts and going on and on about how horrific and awful that is. I remember family members mocking people like me, and even me myself. This is a picture that I have that I've kept close actually over the years. I'm the one in the dark shirt in the front, and that's a stepdad and my uncle mocking me because of something they saw in me that was a little bit too feminine for their taste. I grew up with experience after experience after experience of transphobia. I heard my family members and friends talk about queer folks and talk about how they're freaks and how they're mentally ill and how they're throwing their lives away and how they're self-indulgent and selfish and intemperate. I grew up watching Geraldo Rivera with my cousins in my grandma's basement, going on about presenting people like me as a punchline, as a joke. And so I did what a lot of us do. And if you can relate in any way with those messages, and I think you probably can, even if you didn't grow up in the Adventist tribe, I did what a lot of us do, which is to hide. I did. Kept it all a secret. And, it's funny, I was a professional pastor for 15 years. I was ordained, like Jenner said, I have a master's degree from Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. Worked for many years. I love to preach, love to public speak. Many aspects of the work I deeply, deeply loved and found it incredibly painful when I had to leave it because of my transition. But one of the things that I found interesting or difficult or funny or really hard, I have a picture of myself preaching. I'm very tiny in there. Oops, there we go. Was one of the things I found really interesting, but also frustrating over the years, was how so many people kept secrets within the church. It was really, really frustrating to me. It was frustrating because it felt like everyone in the church tried to pretend like they had it all together, tried to pretend like they didn't have very much sin or problems in their lives. And people would tell, like, I know that because people would tell me their secrets. They would tell me all the time. I was their pastor, and so they would come and confess to me, and they would come dump stuff on me, whether it was a medical diagnosis or a secret addiction, or they secretly were gay, or they drank a lot of alcohol. Drinking alcohol was taboo in the Adventist world, or they couldn't give up smoking, or whatever. Like everyone had secrets. It's just they would only tell the pastor. They wouldn't tell each other. And it was so frustrating to me because of the way that it was corrosive to community. And it drove me wild because I knew that everyone keeps secrets. And it was so annoying. I actually wrote a book about the subject. It's called Hidden. You can find it on my website. If you want to buy it, you can. It's written in my name given at birth. I don't call my birth name my dead name. I know some trans people use the word dead name. My mother lovingly gave me that name, and I love and bless her. And she happily calls me Esther, which is wonderful and a gift. But yeah, I wrote a book about secrets and the ways that impacts us, because I saw it so often as a pastor. And so I think that it's really understandable why we self-conceal, especially queer people, but it also brings a lot of drawbacks, right? Secrets are heavy. It costs us something to hide. It takes energy away from other things that we could give our energy and time to. If I tell you to not think about a white elephant, the only thing you can think about is white elephants. And that's how secrets work. Like in my church, is one of the ways that it was really frustrating was that, the way that we build relational intimacy, the way that we build connections with other human beings is by sharing and hearing one another's secrets. And if nobody's doing that, then community can't be built. And it was so hard to see that missed out on in church community. So often people missed out on connections they could have had, on wisdom that could have been shared. There's all sorts of stuff. So for some of us, we keep so many secrets that we don't even know who to trust. Like, we can't even trust ourselves. For me, I did a lot of dissociating and repression, to the point that when I had no other option but to ask myself honestly questions about my gender, I didn't even know really what the answer fully was. Like, I think I knew what it was on a soul level, but I didn't trust myself at all. One of the biggest impacts, I think, of keeping secrets is the risk of shame. It's the risk of shame. And secrets and shame are interlinked, and I think they kind of exist in a spiral. Sometimes they call it a death spiral, because the things that we hide, because we're hiding them, it's really tempting to feel ashamed about them. And if we feel ashamed about something, the last thing we want to do is to tell anyone about it. And so it builds upon itself. The more ashamed we feel, the more we hide it, and the more we hide it, the more we feel shamed about it. And it can really, really cause some negative stuff in our lives. And I think it's really important to differentiate between shame and guilt. Now we're getting really into therapy world. I'm a trainee master's student therapist right now, so we do all kinds of fun emotion stuff. So I was talking with Selena, Selena. I was talking with her about my feelings wheel up here, but there's a difference between shame and guilt, and sometimes we use them interchangeably. Shame happens when we violate cultural norms, right? So I lived in a really conservative Christian culture that had a lot of norms, and I knew that by being trans, that itself was a violation of those norms, and so I carried around a lot of shame. Guilt happens when I violate my own personal norms, right? When I violate my own personal values. So I do something that I believe is wrong and I feel guilt. So those are, kind of the difference. And, it's interesting because I knew I was violating the church's values by even having these thoughts and questions. At least that's what it felt like. And what's really messed up is that for a time, I really tried to live by and to believe into those values. So I felt a lot of guilt as well. And then it shifted, and then I wasn't feeling so much guilt. I was only feeling shame, but then I went and told everyone, and then it all went away, which was really, really beautiful. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. So if you've ever kept something hidden, so that your family or your friends or your job or your work or your community, if you've ever kept something hidden so that folks around you wouldn't reject you, you probably know what it feels like to have shame. You probably know that deep ache of shame. Now, you might be like me, where your first impulse might be that you should tell everything everywhere all at once. Okay, this is the point. I gotta see anyway. I'm not gonna prompt you to laugh. Okay. But like honestly, your impulse might be to tell to not have any secrets. Like if they're so corrosive to community, if they're so harmful to us, if they steal our energy away, if they cause shame, like why have any secrets at all? Why should like I should tell everything to everyone all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that impulse is understandable, but I think that it also misses it caught my thumbs up. I think it misses an important differentiation. So there's a difference between private and secret. So keeping something secret, like when there's a community around us that's expecting to tell or is demanding information of us, we might be tempted to keep that secret, or if we know that it's something shameful that's in violation of the community, we might keep that secret. And there's drawbacks, but also there's this other concept of privacy, which is more about modesty. It's about self-protection. When we have kids that are 3 or 4 years old, we teach them about modesty for their own self-protection, right? We teach them about okay, when we have company over, we use our bedroom for changing or whatever, right? We teach privacy and modesty for our own protection. And one of the things that the Me Too movement actually taught us is that when what should have remained private is wrenched into view or is grabbed or touched without consent, there is a massive wound that takes place there. And a lot of that has to do with unwanted exposure. And so keeping secrets certainly can have negative drawbacks, but maintaining privacy or even, we could quibble on the definitions, but even keeping secrets, there's a way of seeing that as protecting healthy boundaries. Saying no can be one of the most empowering things that we do, even if we're doing it afterwards, years later in a therapy room where we are reasserting our own autonomy. We're right to protect that which is private. So here's a shocker for you. Visibility is the opposite of secrecy. Thank you, Captain Obvious, right? Visibility is the opposite of secrecy. Okay, like obviously, visibility is the opposite of secrecy. And, often visibility is the antidote to shame. It's the opposite action. There's some schools of therapy that there's some schools of therapy that teach sort of a form of exposure therapy for things that we're really afraid of. And in that type of therapy, we do the opposite action in order to help us feel different. And therapy and shame sometimes can be something like that, right? We feel this deep shame, and there's some crazy way in which by willfully choosing to let people in, to tell them the secret, the shame somehow dissipates. It goes away. It's a magical thing. It's something that I know myself personally very well. And I think it's part of the reason why Transgender Day of Visibility is important, because it's an opportunity and a reminder about the power of being visible, the power that it brings, and the ways that it can defuse and defang the negative effects of hiding and keeping secrets. And so with the few minutes that I have left in my little talk this evening, I want to reflect on some challenges and some opportunities. I didn't get opportunities into this slide, and let's write it in right now. You can see how fun this is. Opportunities of Trans Day of Visibility. There you go. Challenges and opportunities of Trans Day of Visibility. And I'm going to talk about these challenges and opportunities for at least 4 different groups, okay? For folks who are visibly trans, which I tend to be in that category most of the time. For trans people who are closeted, so who are just sort of working out their gender identity, but are not yet presenting in the world or letting anyone in on that. Trans people who are so-called stealth, who no one would necessarily know that they were trans by looking at them or interacting with them. And then, of course, cisgender allies. I'm going to talk to each of these 4 groups for just a minute. Like I said, I'm someone who is generally a visibly trans person. I'm a 6'1" trans lady. I lived for 39 years poisoned by testosterone. At least that's kind of the way that I see it. And it had a lot of effects on me, a lot of unwanted effects, but there you go, they're there. I live in Southern California. I work in Palm Springs. People are incredibly polite. They treat me as a lady. They speak to me that way. And I get around just fine. But also, like people look at me and probably kind of know what's going on. And so I can, so as a visibly trans person, Trans Day of Visibility can present unique challenges, right? It can be a reminder, for example, that I don't have a choice most of the time about whether or not I'm visibly trans. I don't have a choice most of the time about whether or not I'm seen. Every day is Transgender Day of Visibility for me. Like, that's just kind of the reality of it. And so for some of us who are visibly trans, we might be tempted to resist the day or even to experience it as traumatic, and that's okay. And for a lot of us who are visibly trans, we cope with these realities by doing our personal work, by going to therapy, by working through our own internalized transphobia. Even trans people have transphobia. I don't know if those of you who are cisgender knew that, but it's true. We have decades of internalized stuff that we've put down in our souls that affect us. And one of the things that I've found out, though, is that when we're willing and able to do that work and to really face that self-hatred that can sometimes show up, is that what once was our greatest fear or shame can somehow become our superpower. It can be something that we're proud of. It kind of brings me back to that story I told you at the very beginning, that first day that I was out presenting as myself in the world. It was so scary and it was so hard. And, it took an absolute mountain, massive, massive dump truck load worth of courage for me to do that. It was absolutely terrifying. I had to be so brave to do that. And it took similar bravery for me to talk with my wife. It took similar courage for me to go to my church leaders at the time and let them know that, hey, I'm trans and I'm going to be transitioning. It felt like falling on my sword. It felt like committing suicide in a way. It was absolutely terrifying. And also, it grew something inside of me, to choose to expose the secret that had been so shameful. It built this strength inside of me. It's almost like training. I've run 2 marathons in my life. I don't know if you can believe that, but I've run 2 marathons in my life. And one of the things that you do when you prepare to run a marathon is you run a lot. You run 3 or 4 days a week and you're on a schedule and you got to do it and you got to do it. But then when you come to the end and it's time to run the marathon, you have to, oh shoot, I clicked the button. When you come to the end and it's time to run your marathon, you have to take a whole week or even more off. It's called the taper. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Do any of you know what the taper is? Nobody does. Zoom can see my hand raising. It checks you. So it's called the taper. And for like that last week or that last 10 days before your actual race, you don't run at all. And it's terrifying because then you go out there and you go out in the morning of the race and it's freezing cold and it's 8 in the morning and you're going to go run 26 miles without stopping for some reason. And you haven't run at all in like 10 days or sometimes 14 days. And you have to trust that it's in the tank. Gosh. And I've experienced, and it's there, which is magnificent. It's amazing. It's like one of the most cool experiences to have done all that training work and then to discover that it's there, that the ability is there. And I think that something like that is true of being visibly trans in the world. Like we get used to being courageous because we have no choice but to be, and it builds up this strength, and we get better and better at it, and it feels really, 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 really good. The Trans Day of Visibility began as a little bit of pushback back in 2009 to emphasize the positive. At the time, there was Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a day in November to remember all those who died. If you're like the transgender community, people are killed at a far disparate rate than the general population. And so there's a yearly holiday in November to remember all those who passed in that year. But there's this lady, I think in Wisconsin or in Michigan, that on a university campus that wanted to start a day that highlights the positive and the beauty. And so one of the challenges or one of the opportunities, I guess, for visibly trans people is to step into and emphasize how beautiful and joyful it is to be trans. It's not just a loss, it's fantastic. And I'm so grateful to get to live this life and to be alive. Now a word to closeted folks, all right? when I was back in Walla Walla, I was pastoring on a university campus, Walla Walla University. And it was, I graduated from that school for my undergrad, but then I worked there about 5 years after graduation. I worked there for 10 years as a pastor in the church. And the picture I'm showing you is a picture of a presentation, this public forum that took place on campus. In fact, it took place in the church building. This room is directly below my office as I was there pastoring. And this was an event that took place that was very notable because it was a forum that included and platformed quite a number of queer people. There was a trans person, there was openly gay people talking about the intersection of their faith and their LGBTQ identity. And it was a really, really big deal. And it was a big deal that I was there as a pastor. And I participated in the room. I wasn't up front, but I listened. And I was closeted at the time. I was presenting as a man. And I remember one of the people that were presenting was a non-binary person. And they talked with incredible dexterity and eloquence and confidence. And I was just blown away by how intelligent and funny and serious and passionate they were about the topic and their life and how the church had impacted them. And they talked, I remember them very specifically, they were talking about how much it cost them to be doing that presentation in that time and in that place. And how, in a lot of ways, to be doing it in the church was traumatic for them. And that listeners needed to respect and to honor and appreciate that cost. And as I was listening to them speak, a closeted trans person at the time that didn't fully know that, but sort of kind of knew that and was too scared to be honest even about asking the question. I was sitting there listening, and I remember feeling intense empathy for this person. I remember feeling confusion, like I did not understand them at all. I remember feeling intimidated of them. I was in awe of their courage and wisdom, and somehow I was drawn to them. And even now, all these years later, it's probably 6 or 7 years ago, I still feel indebted to this person. And so, for closeted trans people, the trans day of visibility can be challenging because it's like this time where we're celebrating and paying attention to and focusing on trans folks who are visible in the world, but here you are, or here I am, or there I was, not able to be visible, or too scared to be visible. And so there's a way in which Trans Day of Visibility for closeted folks can feel really, really nasty. It can bring up a lot of feelings of guilt or shame. It can bring up a lot of positive stuff too, like I did. It can bring up all the sorts of feelings that I felt for this young person, this non-binary person. And so, if you're a closeted trans person, and if we don't have any closeted trans people in the group today, we almost certainly collectively know someone who's in the closet and who's trans. There's someone represented here. And so I just want to say just a message to closeted trans folks. There's no shame in staying protected. And there's no shame in taking your time. And there's no shame in coming out exactly in the way that works for you. If you're a closeted trans person listening today, you are enough. You are worthy. You don't need to prove anything. And when the time is right, and you have what you need, and you have your people around you, you will share what you need to share. You may change, and you will be ready to change when the time comes for you to change, and that's okay. There's no rush. I have a few words about, maybe 4 probably less for my stealth siblings. The word stealth is sometimes used in the trans community to refer to trans people who are cisgender passing, or who, for whom people in their lives largely don't know that they're trans. You know, like Marty Pyrenek talking about how, you know, she and some folks that she knew sort of went into the witness protection program so that nobody would know they're trans. And um, you know, as someone who uh, doesn't know what that's like, I'm cautious to speak at those folks, but I want to just acknowledge that there are folks who exist as trans in the world that nobody really knows as trans except for the very closest people to them. And it's funny because I think a lot of cisgender people think that they don't know any trans people, and it's just not true. Like, we're everywhere. We're all over the place. You just don't have very good trans radar. Or there's a lot of trans people that are cis passing. And, you know, the more we are able to have access to gender affirming therapies that mitigate the impacts of our uh, puberty that is, you know, associated with our sex assigned at birth. The word I was looking for was endogenous. That's a pretty medically word, but endogenous puberty, that means, you know, internally sourced, versus exogenous puberty. You know, the more we have access to those kinds of therapies, the more people are able to look the way that they feel and want to look. And, you know, there's a lot of trans people who wish that they could appear cisgender, not so much because they hate being trans, although there's sometimes some of us do hate being trans, but they, you know, a lot of us want to appear cisgender because it's so unsafe to be visibly trans. Like, it is really understandable. It's kind of a practical thing. You know, but at the same time, there's also a way in which gender dysphoria can be described as this deep sense of grief for not having been cisgender, or not being able to appear cisgender. And so to me, it seems only natural that that might be a longing, it might be a goal, it might be something someone wants to draw themselves to. And so, you know, I have nothing but shame, or I have no shame whatsoever for folks who are in that position. And I think that a lot of trans people, a lot of visibly trans people, would love to be cis passing and just aren't able to. And, you know, the challenge of Trans Day of Visibility then for some people who are stealth is that it's a choice for them whether or not they want to be visible. And because of the risks and because of the drawbacks of being visibly trans, to me, it's completely understandable why some people who are stealth would choose not to expose that. It totally makes sense. There is not insignificant risks or costs to out yourself, essentially. And those costs are different and more extreme than for cisgender allies. And so I more, I guess you can hear me, I more have just a word of acknowledgement than I have a word of instruction. Finally, to allies, to cisgender allies. When I was presenting as a man, when I was presenting as a pastor, it was very uncommon, or it was very common for me to hear homophobia and transphobia, even as a professional pastor, for years and years and years, in all different kinds of contexts. I've heard just really, really horrific, inappropriate jokes said over the dinner table on Saturday afternoon lunch after church. Adventists go to church on Saturday. And just in almost every context, I've heard it. I heard it from the pulpit. I've heard, like, just all the time. And one of the things that I've noticed that's very interesting to me is that because I live in California, which I'm very grateful for, I really don't hear that stuff anymore. I don't hear the jokes. I don't hear the nasty comments. I don't hear the confused, well, I don't know, why does he have to have a she? Why does she even do that? Doesn't make any sense. Did he have the like all this kind of stuff? Like, I don't hear it anymore. I lived for 38 years as someone who appeared to be cisgender, and there is nothing you can do to convince me it's not still being said. So for cisgender allies, International Trans Day of Visibility, which, you know, we're 6 days past now, is an opportunity for you perhaps to put yourself at risk, to step out and to name your affirmation of trans people. Now, again, I say this cautiously because we all have many intersecting identities. We all have different levels of privilege. We all have different levels of risk. And so this isn't me saying you have to do this or you're a bad person, but it is an invitation to consider. And it may be worth taking that risk for us. It may be worth confronting transphobia when you hear it. It may be worth rejecting that joke when you hear it. It may be worth re-educating someone or offering to educate. It may be worth it to you. Maybe times where that comes up and you can come out in your own way. You can say, you know, I know some people who are like that. And they're brave. They're beautiful. And they're powerful. And that's what I want to close with, honestly, is that to be in the presence of a transgender person, to be in the presence of someone who's visibly trans or who's chosen to let you in on their world is holy. It's beautiful. It's a gift. To see us is to see bravery and vulnerability and hope and power, and I think the divine all at the same time. We've always been here, and we always will continue to be here. It's our collective choice of if and whether or not we will continue to be seen. We get to choose that together, cis and trans people alike. So thanks so much for coming and for listening and for keeping your videos on and showing me your faces. I think we have a few minutes left. I know I have time for some questions. I did want to put up this slide. I have a podcast called Transgender Woman Talking. It is a really inventive title. And I talk about things on that show, and I'm a transgender woman, so there you go. But it's on, you can find it on all the major platforms, and I also have a YouTube channel. And then I also have a website that I write on. There's all sorts of stuff on there. I did I officiated a wedding a few months ago, so I have a homily on there, all sorts of fun little things. So it's estherlowen.com. So if you want to reach out to me or connect, you can do that through either of those means, and I would love to see you. And also, I work at the LGBTQ Center of the Desert in Palm Springs, and let's see, I'm gonna do this. And yeah, I do therapy with people. I'm a trainee student therapist. I will graduate in the fall. But we have a great, really amazing behavioral health clinic here that has a sliding scale. We're low fee, and it's really, really a cool place. And also, we do in-person and video counseling with folks. We work with couples and kids and all kinds of stuff. So, and you don't have to be queer to come. You know, I have clients that are cis straight folks, and they're delightful. So anyway, so there you go. There's my plugs at the end. Questions?